Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial, and this is Trooper, and today we're going to be answering some of the questions you guys have left us over the week. So our first question is, are we talking with other museum ships about the restoration work that they're doing? The answer to that question is yes, all the time. So there is an organization called the Historic Naval Ships Association, which has a conference every single year, usually in September, almost always hosted by a different museum ship. And I believe 2014 was the last time it was hosted by New Jersey. That was also my first year attending. Anyway, at those conferences, I get to meet my counterparts in maintenance and executive levels and curatorial from other museum ships. And we set up relationships that we can talk in between conferences as well. So, for example, us replacing the wood deck, a number of other museum ships, all of the battleships at one time or another have or will have to replace their wood decks. So we're constantly talking with them, finding out what they're using, what their system of coatings are, what they're treating, and what types of wood they're replacing it with. Even though we're in contact with them, no two systems tend to be the same. We're in a number of different environments. So what's good for Missouri and Pearl Harbor isn't necessarily what's best for New Jersey and Camden. We're in a number of different financial situations. So some ships have started to go the futuristic route. The cruiser Little Rock, for example, has replaced their wood deck with a synthetic modern material. And we looked at that as an option, but it isn't in the budget for us. So there are a number of ways to do it. We're talking with them. We're finding out what works, what didn't work for them. These conferences are a great way to hear from people. Like, yeah, we tried this and, it just doesn't work. We had to tear it up and try it again. So all of this informs our decision-making as we're planning for major projects. Our next question is also in the restoration vein. Olympia and Texas, the asker says, are in really bad shape. Both have been out in the water for a very long time without dry docking. And do we have any plans to dry dock the ship anytime soon? The answer is yes, we do. We have a contract with the Navy that says we will dry dock the ship and maintain her in the best material condition possible. And we have even made plans to dry dock the ship by certain dates, usually 5 years in the future. Only one of the Iowa-class battleships has been dry docked as a museum. It's Missouri. I believe it cost them somewhere around $35 million to do that. And they didn't need a long tow because they have the dry dock right there in Pearl Harbor. We theoretically wouldn't need a long tow either because we've got a dry dock right in the Philadelphia Navy Yard, but we would have to remove part of our mast and radars to get under the Walt Whitman Bridge to get there. So it is an expensive proposition. It's something we have to plan years out to save up money for. And it is something we will have to do in the near future. Something we have going for us. The battleship was dry docked in 1990, 1991, right before she was decommissioned. So they blanked over all the sea chests and other openings in the underwater hull, and they renewed the underwater coatings. So she came to us in very good condition. Also, we're the only museum battleship that's sitting in fresh water. As far up the Delaware River as we are, is primarily fresh water. So we are in really good shape. Now, Olympia is right across the river from us, and she holds the record for being the vessel that has gone the longest sitting in water without being dry docked. She was last dry docked in 1945. She does have some maintenance issues, particularly with her shell plating, and it's specifically around the wind-water line. So the part of the ship where the black boot topping stripe is, that's the water level. So as the ship goes by, it's constantly getting wet drying out again, getting wet and drying out. And that's very bad for the coatings and for the steel underneath. So she has a series of perforations right along that wind-water line. The stuff that's permanently submerged is in really good shape. The stuff that's permanently above water is in really good shape. The frame of the ship is in really good shape. It's really just that wind-water line there. She, again, is sitting in fresh water, so she doesn't have the same corrosion issues as other ships. They actually did something really unique in that they created a Cofferdam system. They can basically suction couple into the side of the ship, and then they can drain it and do work along that wind-water line for a couple feet section, and then move that along. And this way, they're able to treat the worst area of the ship, and they're building up a really thick epoxy coating there to protect the steel underneath. And that will be enough to get her through until they're able to raise money to dry dock her. Can she go indefinitely without dry docking? No. Is she going to sink tomorrow? Definitely not. Not with the care they're taking of her. Texas was in a slightly different condition. In the Houston Ship Channel, she is exposed to salt water. She is basically surrounded by sand. So every time the tide comes in and out, that sand scours the paint coatings off of the bottom of the ship. So it's just bare steel, which wastes away. And she was last dry docked in the early 90s. So it's been a while. Typically, an active ship would be dry docked about every 2 years or so. A museum ship is probably safe for every 20 years. So Texas is definitely due for another dry docking. Her main issue are the torpedo blisters that were basically bolted onto the side of the ship during the interwar period. Gives you extra defense against torpedoes, but even when they were new, they leaked. And now here we are decades later, and they definitely leak, and they're not as thick or as high-grade steel as the actual original design shell plating of the ship. So they allow water to get in, and in some cases they retain the water there, which allows it to degrade other parts of the ship. So Texas is in need. She isn't leaking more than the pumps can handle. They are actively making plans to dry dock the ship as we speak. And knowing the people who are working on it within the next year, she will be dry docked and get the care that she needs. Our next question is, did the ship have to point all of the guns in the same direction when she shot? Typically in naval combat, unless you're overwhelmed with targets, you're going to fire all of your guns in the same direction, especially guns of the same caliber. So if we were slugging out with another ship, we'd point all of our 16-inch guns at them and fire them more or less together in one salvo. During shore bombardment, however, this is not necessarily the case. So oftentimes in shore bombardment, it only takes a couple of rounds to destroy a target. So when we're doing shore bombardment, you can aim a single turret at your target. You can even be plotting a solution and aiming your turret at your other turrets at other targets during this time. The battleship had a number of different fire control directors, so she could aim guns in different directions. Also, of course, there are publicity shots, like the famous one where the ship is firing its guns off each broadside. And that would never be done in combat. Some pictures were just taken to get a good photograph. So our next question is there any record of number of people that the ship killed over the course of her career? Is that something that the Navy keeps track of? So things like enemy ships sunk, enemy aircraft shot down, those are often indicated in the ship's logbook. And oftentimes they would be painted on tally boards on the side of the ship. New Jersey does not have one of those in her 1980s configuration, but if you look at Missoura's tally board, you will see different shore bombardment missions they did and mines that they destroyed, and possibly even aircraft they destroyed during World War II, in addition to the ship's ribbon board and whatnot. there isn't really a single location that has written down that Battleship New Jersey destroyed X number of aircraft or killed X number of people. During World War II, onshore bombardment missions and the Korean War, that wasn't really something that was enumerated. During the Vietnam War, it was a big part of Secretary of Defense McNamara's strategy to estimate number of combatants killed and actually put numbers to things to find efficiencies. So there are definitely records, and I believe the National Archives are digitizing all of those records of different estimated kills. There's a website somewhere you can go online and look up shore bombardment missions that ships did, and it'll give you the date, what they fired at, what they claim they destroyed, number of combatants expected to be killed. It's extremely problematic, because when somebody is killed by a battleship 16-inch shells, there isn't exactly much left to identify. So if you find a couple of pieces, how many combatants does that actually equal out to? So the McNamara's whole strategy there has been much criticized in the years since as not being an accurate way of defining. Short answer to this question is no, there isn't really a single source that lists how many kills we had. No, it's not exactly something that the Navy keeps track of, although bomb damage assessment after shore bombardment is a common modern practice. So our next question is, did metallurgy play a role in different armor thicknesses? Short answer to that is yes, very much so. And we're actually going to film a video at some point in the future that talks about different ship armoring systems. But for slightly more of an answer, early ship armoring schemes involved iron backed with wood. Early versions of steel were not very effective, and they also involved wood. As we started to develop alloys, so first Harvey nickel-plated steel, and then Krupp cemented armor. Armor was able to get thinner and be just armor standalone without a wood backing. Eventually, we started to add more elements to these alloys to make them more effective, and we heated the steel in different ways when we were forging it. So steel can be too brittle, and if you hit it, even though it's thick, it'll shatter, or it can be too soft, and any small hit will just deform the whole plate. So they looked at heating different thicknesses of the surface of the plate to make it brittle on the outside to stop projectiles, but soft on the inside, that if something starts to punch through, it will bend and deflect instead of allowing something to just break straight through. So yes, that plays a part in determining the thickness and effectiveness of armor. And really rough estimate, German and American armor, our Class A or Class B armor, and German Krupp armor was relatively on par metallurgically. British Dussel armor was probably the best. It was probably a little bit more effective than than American or German armor, and Japanese armor was probably the worst. It was maybe 10% less effective than American or German, whereas British was about 10% more effective than American or German. And so you see ships like Yamato armored with up to 26 inches of armor plating, and that was really necessary to get the same equivalent thickness as these other countries. The way you layer the armor and angle it also has an impact on how thick you make it, and that is something we will definitely discuss in future videos. Alright, so our next question is, how did the Army and the Marine Corps' needs for amphibious landing ships affect the Navy's progress in building Iowa-class battleships? That's a really good question. It's often been said that you had to suspend construction of battleships to build more aircraft carriers and destroyers and landing craft and all of that. The short answer for this one is the construction of landing craft did not really affect the construction of battleships. Battleship construction is limited by the amount of high-grade armor plating you can build and slipways where you can build those ships. Landing craft are not built by the same yards on the same slipways, and they just use mild steel or even wood in their construction. So you're not really taking materials or building spaces away from battleships to do that. Building smaller ships like destroyers or new capital ships like carriers that need those big slipways does affect laying down battleships and the length of time to construct them. So our next question is, when were the 20mm guns removed? Battleship New Jersey and the other Iowa-class battleships are often said that they had 49 20mm guns during World War II. In actuality, they were designed probably with a little bit more than that, and some were removed when additional 40mm guns were added. And then she probably carried more than that because by the end of the war, some of the 20mm had been turned into double-barreled 20mm. By her first Korean War deployment in 1951, she was down to 16 twin 20mm mounts. It was down to 16 20mm mounts with 2 twins up here at the bow, 2 twins on each side here, 2 twins here, and 2 twins back aft here. At some point in 1951, either during that Korean War deployment or immediately after, all of these guns were removed. Why was that? Well, the 20mm gun was no longer effective against aircraft, especially large modern jet fighters. They couldn't bring them down or track them effectively. And they were a little bit too much to keep in a point defense role, so they get replaced by 50 caliber mounts that can be removed and brought out as needed. So, now we have a couple questions that were submitted by kids. Our first question is sent in by James, and he's asking, what was the area where the missiles are now originally used for? So, here you've got a picture of the ship as built, a model of the ship as built in World War II. And here you have a model of the ship in the 1980s. So you can see here amidships and back aft is where all of the missiles were added. During World War II, this area was primarily 40mm guns. We've got some 5-inch guns here. These 5-inch guns and these 5-inch guns had to be removed. These 40mm guns were removed. But believe it or not, the mounting where they're sitting was retained. Rather than cut it back down flush and then drop this platform on top, they simply built this platform over these 40mm guns and put the phalanx on top of where these 40mm guns were. And back aft they cleared out the 5-inch guns, which were under here, and the 40mm mount here, and put in a flat platform. So our next question is from Cadence, and she would like to know why the bottom of ships tends to be painted red. It's not always painted red. For example, Italian battleships tended to have green painted bottoms. Russian Navy ships also have different bottoms. When Missouri went into dry dock most recently, her bottom was painted the same gray as the rest of the ship, I believe, from pictures I've seen. So why is it painted red? Why is it painted at all? The bottom is an anti-fouling coating, so it's got some extra additives that the top paint doesn't need. Because it's constantly submerged, marine growth likes to stick onto the bottom of it. And that marine growth builds up, makes the ship wider and less hydrodynamic, and will slow the ship down. So these special coatings have different oxides and stuff in it that will try and prevent stuff from growing on them, and also protect the hull from corroding. So because it's different from the rest, you want it to be a different color so you know what's going on there. Possibly one of the reasons why it's red is so that you can see if the ship is too lightly loaded. The black line is where the ship is supposed to sit when it's in the water normally loaded. And if it's any higher or lower than that, then either it's doesn't have enough weight and waves could knock the ship over, or it's too low, it's got no reserve of buoyancy. If it starts to take on water, it'll sink very quickly. So having the red paint there is a very clear indicator. If you start to see that something's wrong. So in addition to that, the ship, because she is not fully loaded, is actually sitting higher in the water than she should be. As a museum, we chose to move that black boot topping down several feet and thus make the gray patch a little bit taller, so that she would look more like she did when she was in service, even though it's not in an accurate position. A number of museum ships have chosen to do this rather than expose the red bottom paint. And also, this red bottom paint is way more expensive because of all the extra stuff in it, so the less area you have to cover with it, the better for a museum ship. So, remember to like, share, or subscribe. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments down below and we'll do our best to answer them as quick as possible. And if you would like to support the ship, our mission, the content we're creating, check the description down below for ways you can support us and donate. Thanks for watching from me and Trooper here, and I'll see you guys next time.